Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. We're pleased to welcome you back to the Right City Conference. This is day 2. This year, our focus is to have discussions on human rights in the digital age. And we're really pleased on behalf of all our partners to bring together some of the world's top experts on these issues that governments, NGOs, the UN are struggling to wrap their heads around and find solutions. An interesting thing here, there's a Facebook report that came out a little while ago that's showing that Uyghur activists in Canada were being targeted through inauthentic campaigns. So this is something that is touching many countries. It's not a theoretical discussion, it's an actual real discussion that is important and we need to wrap our heads around as well. So I'd like to take the time now to introduce our moderator, Melody Petrie, who's an advocacy director at Access Now. Melody, thank you for joining us. I know you're probably just catching your breath after a RightsCon last week, which was amazing event. But I would like to ask Melody to take the floor and introduce our speakers and take the conversation from there.
Of course, thank you very much. And yes, exactly. I am just out of RightsCon, where this very topic was discussed in many sessions, sometimes even like divided into different sessions, because unfortunately the digital threats, the digital attacks against civil society have increased. We are now talking about an erosion of the civic space, but also an erosion of democracy. And that's why I am really excited to have this conversation today and to have 3 excellent panelists who all have different expertise to discuss the topic today. So I'll briefly share a few points when it comes to what to expect from this conversation, noting that when we talk about digital attacks, for a very long time, we were talking about a bit like unreal attacks. Some people were even calling making a difference between the online world and the offline world, calling it the real world, which in that case would mean that digital attacks are unreal. And I can testify, and I've spoken with many others who could also testify, that digital attacks are very much real. So for this discussion today, I am pleased to welcome 3 speakers, Bethany, Isabel, and Steve. I am sure that they will have a lot to say and a lot to contribute. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to pop them into the chat. I'll make sure to discuss them and to address them. But I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers before letting them tell us more about their work. But we'll first hear from Steve Fieldstein, who is the author of a new book, The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. So quite on topic and quite on brand for the session today. Steve is also a senior fellow at Carnegie, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. We will then hear from Bethany Allen, who is the China reporter at Axios. Finally, we will hear from Isabel Linzer, who just wrote a report for Freedom House when she leads on technology and democracy, and specifically on election watch for the digital age. So welcome all, and without further ado, I'll let the floor to Steve for him to tell us a bit more about his work and maybe about his recent book in the context of today's session.
Well, thank you, Melody, for the nice introduction and for framing the discussion for this session. I'm really looking forward to the conversation between us and also hearing from your questions. And so as Melody mentioned, I recently published a book on the rise of digital repression. And so I'll spend the next few minutes talking about some of the findings in that book and how they relate to, actually they directly encompass, I think, the themes of what we're talking about today. And so when I approached this project about 3 years ago, my goal was really to both understand better what the nature of different patterns of digital repression look like. So to really hone in on sort of parsing out what we're talking about when we mention digital oppression, and then to understand some of the key aspects in terms of the relationship between traditional repression and digital techniques, what factors are most relevant in determining whether leaders will deploy digital tools to advance their objectives. What role are external actors, particularly China and Russia, playing when it comes to proliferating the deployment of these tools, and whether it's even possible to quantify the prevalence of who is using what. And so these questions not only led me to kind of look broadly at a lot of data when it came to understanding what digital oppression exactly is and how it's distributed, but I also ended up undertaking 3 case studies, each of which forms a chapter in the book, where I went to Thailand, the Philippines, and Ethiopia to interview people on the ground and talk about their experiences and what kind of motivation and incentives are guiding the deployment and use of advanced technologies for repressive purposes. Second of all, while authoritarian countries, while there's much more prevalence of digital technology, digital oppression in authoritarian countries, democracies, particularly weak democracies, are also high. You also see high prevalence of digital oppression as well. So some of the countries that I'm most concerned about, where you're seeing kind of leading levels, new trends of digital oppression, include India, where you're seeing the imposition of mass surveillance systems, not to mention greater scrutiny and constraints on social media. Brazil, large amounts of disinformation. Turkey, and a number of other sort of hybrid mixed regimes or weak democracies. So it's not an authoritarian problem. It is a global problem in terms of this issue.
One of the countries that you mentioned, which is China and its role into what is perceived as digital repression, but especially as exporting digital repression tools and policies. And our next speaker specializes on the country. And so, Isabel, can you tell us a bit more? Have you come to similar conclusion? Have you observed similar facts when it comes to the role and the place of China into these digital threats and attacks? Or is this something that maybe is more of a projection of Western fears, as we say? I'm really looking forward to hear from your perspective.
What I want to talk about is the growing extraterritorial authoritarian governance that the Chinese government is exercising over the digital space, and especially how US tech companies are increasingly complicit in exchange for profit and access to the Chinese market. Chinese law requires, and these are some new Chinese laws passed in the past, within the last 5 to 6 years. Chinese law requires electronic service communications providers operating within China's borders to monitor live communications, to block content deemed politically sensitive or illegal, to suspend accounts transmitting such content, and to hand over any related data and personal information upon request by a Chinese law enforcement or national security agency. The new cybersecurity law that took effect in June 2017 requires companies to store data for Chinese users on servers in China, strengthening Chinese state control over this information. And the new national security law, which was, I believe, implemented in 2015, requires any entity or company or individual who is asked to assist China's law enforcement or security agencies to, if they're asked for assistance in any kind of national security investigation, they are required to provide that assistance, and they're also required to keep that assistance a secret. Now, this is part of what people call China's rule by law, wherein they are codifying their authoritarian practices into law, as opposed to just doing them and pretending that they're not doing them. And this makes it more difficult for US companies to avoid complying with these laws. And it also gives them an out. When they are questioned by US media outlets, for example, oh, we discovered that you're doing this thing in China, why are you doing it? Then companies can say, oh, we're just abiding by local law, as we do in every market. And that is an excuse that we see over and over and over again from Zoom, from Apple, from lots of companies. So just briefly, Apple also has followed the path of becoming more deeply integrated into Chinese government institutions. And a recent example is that they opened will be opening a data center in a Chinese province. That data center is operated by a Chinese state-owned company. So Chinese government employees are going to be the ones who are actually operating that data center, and the encryption keys are stored in that facility. If Apple wants to prevent the Chinese government from accessing Chinese user data, it may not even be able to. And very briefly, Google, the example of Google, in 2017, they started exploring or creating a bespoke pre-censored search engine for China called, codenamed Project Dragonfly. That project was leaked to The Intercept in 2018, but it took almost an entire year of intense media coverage, of further leaks about the project. Google employees, 1,400 Google employees signed an open letter saying that they wanted that project to be canceled. Vice President Mike Pence called out Google by name in a speech and called for the project to be canceled. The CEO of Google went in front of a congressional committee to defend the project. It took a year of that much pressure for Google to finally suspend the project. Why? We can only presume it's because of money and access to the platform. So, what we're seeing here is the real, almost unavoidable pull of the money that is available in the Chinese market.
When we talk about information coming out, obviously one of the other topics and one of the other threats that is on the rise in this discussion is internet shutdowns. And so at Access Now, we've done a lot of work on internet shutdowns and looking especially at their role during elections, and the fact that in the past 3 years, countries have started to increasingly order intentional internet shutdowns just before, during, or after an election. And so we have denounced this practice as a threat to democracy, in addition to a violation of human rights. But Isabel, let me turn to you now, because I know that you've done quite a lot of work on elections and, like democracy and elections. And so have you seen, in addition to internet shutdowns, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about this, but what other threats and what other attacks have we been able to see, and what in your work is relevant for this conversation?
Thanks, Melody, and thanks to the other panelists as well. We've touched on some themes that I'm really looking forward to talking about. And also thanks, Right City, this is a great opportunity to talk about such an obviously important topic, and it's one that we are working on constantly at Freedom House in kind of across the organization. Our programs teams support activists documenting and raising awareness about human rights abuses. Our emergency assistance program has supported over 4,000 individuals and organizations in over 110 countries who are threatened due to their human rights work. And digital attacks, especially on human rights defenders, are also a major theme in Freedom House's research, and that's mostly what I want to talk about today. In particular, Freedom on the Net, our annual survey of internet freedom in 65 countries, looks at how the rights of internet users are protected or violated online, as well as the offline repercussions that they face for online activities. We also track those risks specifically ahead of elections, as Melody mentioned. And the use of digital technology to target activists was also a major theme in our special report on transnational repression that I co-authored, and we'll talk about a bit later. In 38 of the 65 countries that we look at in Freedom on the Net, there were technical attacks against government critics or human rights organizations. Thinking back to earlier this year, a Cuban independent journalist and government critic lost access to her Facebook account very shortly after some critical reporting, and it was apparently hacked into in retribution for her work. That's quite a common problem that Cuban critics face, but also others around the world. Surveillance and harassment online are two other key methods by which people are targeted, and they're also two very important components of transnational repression, as documented by our report Out of Sight, Not Out of Reach, which came out in February. So of the 31 governments that engage in physical transnational repression, meaning they have attacked, kidnapped, assassinated, unlawfully deported, or detained one of their nationals abroad. At least 17 of them also use spyware against exiles in diaspora. And that's notwithstanding the dozens of countries that use spyware domestically. China is one of these countries, and Bethany has spoken some about this already, and they've used powerful spyware abroad against Uyghurs, against Tibetans, and others. But this list of governments using spyware to target activists in countries elsewhere does not only include global powers, which I think is something that can get lost in some of the focused coverage. Smaller countries like Rwanda use spyware too. For example, in the famous NSO WhatsApp hack a couple of years ago, it came out that at least 6 Rwandans were among those targeted in the hack. On harassment, at least 22 of the governments engaging in physical transnational repression also use online threats and harassment as part of that strategy of transnational repression overall.
I think it's a cat and mouse struggle. And, you know, we're right now at a moment, that I think Isabel characterized really well, which is that we're seeing multiple years of authoritarian resurgence. And so I don't think you can separate out the digital from that. As you see an increasing number of governments turn authoritarian or embrace authoritarian methods, I think you're naturally going to see pressure against one of the main instruments that activists have and citizens have in which to communicate and to potentially challenge, autocratic rule. And so by nature itself, even if these tools can bring about, significant liberalizing effects, because they are viewed as such threats by rulers, they're naturally attracting more scrutiny.
I'm going to come to you, Bethany, because someone asked a question about, you mentioned the BuzzFeed investigation about the Uyghur camp, which actually just want to put it there. And there is a question from the audience about the Uyghur who are living in the West, because they have also been targeted. They've been targeted by troll armies to silence them and intimidate them. And so someone from the audience was asking what can be done to prevent this. And this is a technique that Isabel also mentioned during her presentation as sometimes intimidating activists to the point that they retire from activism. Is this a concern that you have?
Absolutely. And with Uyghurs specifically, I mean, Uyghurs abroad have been the target of all different kinds of attempts at repression from the Chinese government. And some of them can't really do much about. For example, for several years now, public security bureaus in Xinjiang have very, very closely monitored the family members of Uyghurs in Xinjiang if they're outside of China. So if you're living in France or you're living in the US, police in Xinjiang will go to your family's home, your relative's home, and have your relative communicate with you via probably WeChat. We need this information, tell us where you work, how long you've worked there, whatever, and send this information back to us. And if you don't, then maybe your mother or your brother or your niece will be put into a camp. Also, for any Uyghur abroad, literally any Uyghur abroad with family in China, they know, and either because it's been communicated to them, or at this point, it doesn't even need to be communicated to them. They know that if they speak out, then their family members in China are likely going to experience harassment and very likely be put into a camp or into some kind of detention facility.
Thank you very much. And that will be the last word from our panel, because we're coming to time. I was really honored and privileged to have this discussion with the three of you. I personally learned a lot, and I'm working in this field, and looking at the questions that were coming in, I'm sure that people who were watching and following this conversation also learned. Please keep the conversation going. I know that there is still a lot of engagement via the hashtag RightsCity. And I'm sure that any of the panelists, a lot of the material was also shared in the chat and online. And I'm sure that we'll continue this chat. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Bethany. Thank you very much, Isabel. And thank you to the organizers of RightsCity for providing the space for this conversation.
Thank you, Melody, for doing an amazing job moderating. Steve, Isabel, and Bethany, thank you so much. We'll get this online soon so people can watch it again. Please share it. And I just want to tell everyone watching, this is the end of day 2 of Right City, but tomorrow we're going to be having 2 panels. One is on moving to unite democracies on tech, with a really interesting group of people from the National Endowment for Democracy, from IREX, from the Global Public Policy Institute, and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, followed by then a discussion on using social media as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes, with people from Bellingcat, University of California, Berkeley, and as well as from the University of Ottawa. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.